Hi everyone. My name is Jade Grogan and I'm commissioning editor on the Arden Shakespeare list for Bloomsbury. I think it might just be a slight echo. Yeah, I think that's fixed that. So I commission across a range of subjects in early modern and Shakespeare studies, as well as working on the Arden Fourth series of Shakespeare's play texts, poems and sonnets, which are actually in their 125th anniversary year this year, with the new series due to start publishing from 2026 onwards. Thanks so much for joining us today and welcome to our workshop, Teaching Shakespeare and Performance Now. This workshop is focused on teaching global Shakespeare performance, Shakespearean text in performance, and Shakespeare on film. So we have a presentation from three of our Arden authors and editors. That's Alexa Alice Joubin, Mark Thornton Burnett, and Abigail Rokison-Woodall, who specialise in Shakespeare and performance. And that will be followed by a discussion between them and you, our attendees. And they will each offer insights into their own teaching and provide tools for other teachers and researchers to use. The workshop will last for 1 hour and it will be recorded except for the Q&A. Just some housekeeping before I introduce our panel. Microphones are muted while we listen to our speakers, but please make use of the Q&A function. It allows you to ask a specific question outside of the chat. After the speakers' presentations, there will hopefully be at least 20 minutes for questions and discussion. So you're encouraged to put those questions in the little Q&A bit, and we'll get to them in the second half. If you want to ask a question directly, you can raise a hand, turn your camera and mic on, or you can just put it in the chat. We're joined in the background also by Vivian Quick, Marketing Manager for the Arden Shakespeare, who will be managing the Q&A and is making sure everything runs smoothly. I'm also joined by my colleague, Mark Dudgeon, Senior Publisher for Arden Shakespeare and Methuen Drama, who is just going to talk briefly about a relevant resource to this workshop, and that's Drama Online. Thank you.
Thank you, Jade. We saw mentioned in the chat a moment ago that there's a bit of a reverb. I hope that improves. You might just put in the chat a bit later if it hasn't improved, and we can try to do something about that. But yeah, as Jade has said, my name is Mark Dudgeon. I'm the Senior Publisher here for Shakespeare and Theatre Studies at Bloomsbury. My publishing on the Arden Shakespeare list ranges across critical studies of Shakespeare's work and include Professor Joubin's edited book, Contemporary Readings and Global Performances of Shakespeare, which Professor Joubin will be mentioning a bit later. And I'm also the publisher of the Shakespeare and Adaptation series, which is edited by another of our guest authors, Mark Thornton Burnett. I'm going to take a moment just to highlight one of our digital resources, which you may be familiar with already, but it's been a real boon for teaching and studying Shakespearean performance. So Drama Online is our award-winning digital library. It contains thousands of play texts, several hundred books, and over 800 hours of streaming content. It's got a wide range of Shakespeare resources, from the Arden Shakespeare play editions and critical studies to filmed theatre performances, audio plays, and acting masterclasses as well. Most of the video collections on Drama Online are Shakespeare related, and our Shakespeare performance partners include the Royal Shakespeare Company, Shakespeare's Globe, the National Theatre, Stratford Festival in Ontario, besides others as well. As well as that, the site has also got specially commissioned pieces to help you to make the best use of the content. Now, one of these featured content pieces was written by Professor Stephen Purcell, and it's on the subject of using streamed content in the Shakespeare classroom, called Spotlight on Soliloquies. Vivian's just going to add a link to that in the chat, but I'd encourage you to explore the site for yourself, and there'll be access details again shared in the chat, so you can explore Drama Online and explore the Shakespeare part of the site in particular. But for now, I'll hand back to Jade.
Thanks, Mark. Now I'll introduce our three wonderful authors who will be speaking today. So first, we'll hear from Alexa Alice Joubin, Professor of English, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, Theatre, International Affairs and East Asian Languages and Cultures at George Washington University. Alexa is the editor of the just published Contemporary Readings in Global Performances of Shakespeare. And secondly, we have Mark Thornton Burnett, Professor of Renaissance Studies at Queen's University Belfast. Mark is series editor for the Arden Shakespeare and adaptation series, as Mark just mentioned, the second Mark. And last but not least, we have Abigail Rokison-Woodall, who is Deputy Director of the Shakespeare Institute at the University of Birmingham. Abigail is General Editor for the Arden Performance Companions and the Arden Performance Editions, as well as the author of the recently published Shakespeare and the Cock, as well as the editor for the forthcoming Arden Performance Edition of Richard III. And now we'll start with Alexa. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm speaking about teaching global Shakespeare today and to think together about the end and the ends of global Shakespeare as a genre and a field of study. I've been thinking that the notion may be outliving its usefulness as a theoretical concept, but there are many ways to teach worldwide adaptations of Shakespeare. There have been centuries of performances of Shakespeare in many languages, but in academia, the field emerged fairly late. It coincided with the neoliberal policies of unrestrained free trade and affordable international travel, particularly in the 1990s. And so the field has enriched textual criticism and vice versa, especially with its attention to embodied meanings. But at the same time, more recently, there has been criticism saying that global Shakespeare has been co-opted for new forms of ethno-nationalism, for example. And now we have to think about, when we teach this subject, how do we analyze diverse and polyphonic performances around the world with an eye toward equity and social justice? And in particular, I paid attention to what we call epistemic justice. And this is a term coined by Miranda Fricker in 1999. She categorizes two types of injustice: testimonial injustice, referring to silenced voices or voices that have been distrusted without due cause. And there's hermeneutical injustice, which refers to cross-cultural misunderstanding due to lack of access to resources, to interpreted resources. Some cultures have historically been excluded, and they may seem less intelligible. This is especially true of subjects that do not fit established categories. And many scholars have participated in this discourse and debate. Chris Thurman and Sandra Young, for example, they theorize that global Shakespeare is complicit in some kind of cultural appropriation, making all of these elsewheres, these performances elsewheres, into exotic distractions or objects. And I believe that the global is erroneously imagined to be whatever the United States and the United Kingdoms are not, in the sense of it must be non-English speaking and so forth. And you will see shortly that I propose a new way to teach Shakespearean performance. And I view everything, all adaptations, as global inherently. So we unfortunately have inherited a lot of norms from how things were done previously, and Maeve McEwen calls this structural conditioning. An example is, for example, in Rita Sen's writing, she critiques the uneven expectations of scholarly labor, where no footnote is required for Aristotle's Poetics, but detailed and distracting explanations are required for every single thing that is indigenous. So in my thinking, actually, Aristotle would be better off with explanatory notes. We would do well to explain the transmission of Aristotelian misogyny into English culture through the translation of an Arabic treatise, for example. And analysis of English language white Shakespeare would be more on point by situating it not as a yardstick, but as a part of globalization. So I propose a number of ways to counter this structural conditioning. I believe we can eradicate epistemic injustice by promoting substantive diversity in the ways that we treat the material and think about the material. So one strategy is to write alt texts together. And I think even though alt text tends to be thought of as an accommodation strategy for technology design, it is actually the foundation to performance analysis, whether we talk about stage or the screen. And through writing alt text for performances in all languages, including in the English language, paying attention to cinematographic decisions, to mise-en-scène, to casting, to blocking, for instance, we can teach English language performances as part of the global culture. We can connect understudied regions and genres. We can pay more attention to non-linear narratives historically. For example, Shakespeare does not simply travel from England emanating out to the rest of the world. The path is often meandering, and we can begin to connect more with these historical facts rather than continue to be affected by a colonial discourse and assumption. An example, of course, of teaching all of the things together is that we can expand the conceptualization of global Shakespeare by not only juxtaposing, but also connecting understudied regions and genres. You see Akira Kurosawa's Japanese film here on the left, Throne of Blood from 1957, which is now a canonical adaptation of Macbeth. That film in itself has inspired many, many works, among them, on the right here, Antunes Filho's Brazilian stage production called Trono de Sangue, 1992. There are many, many others, and here's just the mountain spirit, the witch scene with the spinning wheel. We can have endless discussions of visual echoes of how an adaptation responds not only to Shakespeare, but also to another canonical adaptation, creating their own network. We can think about, for example, how Armenian theater makers brought Shakespeare to Ottoman Turkey and how Turkish performers influenced Iranian adaptations of Shakespeare. So in other words, we begin to pay attention to rhizomatic networks and not just no longer a linear narrative or kind of one-way street of influence. We can also use diverse theoretical models, among them the Brazilian theory of cultural anthropophagy. It's a kind of a digestive model of ingesting different cultural elements and producing something that is organically building upon that. And we can present case studies without bracketing global performances as always only opposite to white productions. So specifically, I have published this open access textbook called screenshakespeare.org. So if you follow this link, and particularly this sublink, you will be able to see under the tab theory and analysis. If you click writing an alt text, you can see how this works pedagogically in the classroom, how I write alt text with students together to build, to turn it into a collaborative knowledge building exercise. I believe Global Shakespeare is an excellent opportunity for collaborative learning. We can learn together. No one person would, for example, know all the languages. And so this foreign language proficiency can become an asset. We can piece things together. It's more often practiced in STEM, right? The collaboration eventually build a rocket, aim for the moon. And we have different proficiency, different type of knowledge in other cultural histories. Again, that can be brought together. So it is a teamwork in order to construct larger scale knowledge. And we can also see alt text as a first step to a thick description to pay attention to overlapping layers of cultural significance, connections between what was previously assumed to be siloed works. And we can counter the overemphasis of political meanings of global Shakespeare, to also balance it out with analysis of aesthetic meanings. So these are just some benefits. Anthropologically speaking, what is thin description would be a photographic summary of behaviors in performance. What is thick description would be actually contextualization of the motives for the behaviors and even the reception of the behaviors. And these are important points to bear in mind, and I believe that's the benefit of teaching global Shakespeare through alt text and thick description. Thick descriptions make the plausible believable in drama, and so it is time to return to the foundation of playmaking. I want to now mention my new book published with Arden Bloomsbury called Contemporary Readings in Global Performance of Shakespeare. It's hot off the press, just came out now, and I believe Vivian will be sharing a discount code now in the chat. I divided this book, which is wonderful teamwork, into 3 sections, starting with methodologies, and then we have big pictures, and we conclude with case studies. So in methodologies, we have demonstrations of how to read translation without necessarily accessing other languages, how to read global world cinema productively, how to read across borders, and how to read kaleidoscopic modernity. Mark Burnett is with us today. He'll be speaking today, and he contributed a chapter on world cinema, highly recommended. The second part deals with big pictures. So these would kind of build a foundation for discussion of global Shakespeare. The way to use this book in teaching, I believe, is to close read 1 or 2 of the theory chapters, and look at the methodologies. And then you don't necessarily teach the entire world. Your course may be focused specifically on Asian Shakespeare, for example, Southeast Asia, and you can pick one of these chapters to build a foundation, having a big picture, a historical chronology, all the necessary knowledge in order to make sense of, in order to help us write the alt text and thick description. In the next section, case studies. Here we have Bollywood films such as Hyder, which is a famous adaptation of Hamlet. We have virtual theater in Zoom during the pandemic, and many fascinating topics. You can see I made a point of to counter the structural conditioning of global Shakespeare, counter the assumption that global Shakespeare must mean non-English performances. I have a chapter on the UK, I have a chapter on Canada. And to put them on equal footing in our analysis of performances in general, because one of the points that the book is making is that all performances are global by definition. And we conclude with an interview chapter written by me. I interviewed Catherine Hennessy on her very unique experience teaching global Shakespeare in so many different countries. So I hope this would be helpful. For starter, I very much look forward to our discussion and talking more about what it means to teach global performances today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexa. I think we're going to turn now to Mark Thornton Burnett.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today about teaching with Shakespeare and film. I'll be talking about my teaching at Queen's University Belfast and teaching Shakespeare on film worldwide, with all examples, resources referenced in the chat and also in the last 2 slides. Now, most recently, I've been running an MA module, Shakespeare and Asia. We study 6 film adaptations of 3 plays, Hamlet, Macbeth, and Romeo and Juliet, including The Banquet, 2006, from China, and from India, Kemet Sit Kemet Tak, Romeo and Juliet, 1988. As principle, and as the structure of the module confirms, 1 week play, 1 week film adaptations, I am keen to encourage conversations about the relationship between a Shakespearean text and its cinematic afterlives. It's only by knowing the play, I suggest, that a particular adaptation can be appreciated. At the same time, this is a module that depends on a full deployment of film technology. It's only by knowing the vocabulary, I suggest, that the adaptation can begin to be assessed in terms of its broader nuances and implications. Accordingly, even before the core content, I introduce students to film theory and language. There is no set handbook. Rather, I put together my own glossary derived from various sources, ensuring that the terms explained match the approach in class to the film adaptations themselves. In other words, I embed our opening sessions in discussion throughout. As well as the core content, I reserve space for student presentations. There are some wonderful film and performance resources to access in this regard. Alexa Joubin's Screening Shakespeare, just mentioned, the Global Shakespeare's website, and the much underused Akira Kurosawa Digital Archive. Here are some of those references. The pedagogical purpose and effect of such presentations? Well, because the presentations are not on the module examples, I find that individual students, they all receive feedback, are immediately empowered in expanding their knowledge base. And because presentations are delivered in class, the whole group benefits, coming away with a richer sense of a field which is co-created. This is a module centered on non-Anglophone Shakespeares. It might, for some, be an introduction to the discipline of global Shakespeares. That is why I spend time at the start talking through 4 pertinent areas of inquiry. Secondary criticism on the plays, which have a bearing on the adaptations we explore. Adaptation theory, Stephen O'Neill and Diana Henderson's globally angled Arden Research Handbook of Shakespeare Adaptation is hugely relevant. Discussions of global Shakespeares and methodology, and D, praxis of subtitling. It's important, I note, to bear in mind that we may be accessing a particular example via a mediated English translation, which carries with it both challenges and opportunities. It's salutary then to introduce both subtitle versions of Kurosawa's Throne of Blood or Macbeth 1957 with their contrasting antique contemporary ambitions and agendas. In this, I'm aided by the fact that this module is always already an intercultural classroom. We come to it with different language specialisms and from various nations and cultures, a situation that allows of interchange. For example, last year, a visiting student from China and a student from Northern Ireland worked together for their presentation to create subtitles for a Taiwanese puppet adaptation of Julius Caesar. The experience proved enabling for them and illuminating for the class as a whole. Beyond my own institution, in other departments, I teach Shakespeare on film, incorporating global examples. Kenneth Branagh's Henry V, 1989 is a good place to start in that it raises salient questions about nationalism, idealism, identity, and political context. His work enjoys cultural currency. Thatcherism, the Falklands, is one of the obvious contexts that suggests itself. I keep with context in showing clips from other films which may not be as familiar. For example, an extract from Hemile the Tongo Hamlet 1964 from Ghana is productive in that it invites us to think through colonial legacies, independence movements, language, and the role of Shakespeare in those operations. Incidentally, thought lost for many years, this film is now publicly accessible on the Internet Archive. Similarly, I might include a segment from a Hungarian adaptation of King Lear, Romani Chris, 1997, an in-part Romani language film set in the traveller community, which, through Shakespeare, highlights issues around depopulation, human rights, and contested concepts of Europe. Crucially, these introductions take the form of a competition. I do not name the source, but instead break the class into 3 groups, asking them to identify the play, country, date, and film technique, awarding points for each estimate. After 3 rounds, we tally the points together, I reveal the answers, and the prizes are awarded. It's a handy way of alerting students to the diversity of adaptations as well as the uses of Shakespeare ideologically. Romeo and Juliet adaptations are particularly facilitative cinematic instances to talk about, with adaptations such as Suicide Story 2000 from Italy and Anayam Rasulum 2013 from South India, pointing up themes relating to race, caste, migration, and community, and encouraging reflection on social justice and Shakespearean adaptations as aspiring to being recuperative. Such an exercise is also about raising awareness of the range of Shakespeare on film adaptations. But I also try to use film to teach back to Shakespeare, or rather, to locate in films ways of elucidating the text. In addition to Shakespeare in Asia, I teach an upper-level module on Shakespeare's plays, and I conscript film clips in kick-off or endpoint applications. Julie Taymor's Titus, the opening scene, 1999, is a fruitful route into a discussion of crypts, bodies, victory and spectacle in Shakespeare's envisioning of Roman republicanism in Titus Andronicus. While an episode from Matthias Pinheiro's Sycorax, 2021, can be brilliantly suggestive in pushing at comment about gender, patriarchal oppression, ownership, and voice. This short, a Spanish-Portuguese-Argentinian collaboration, centers on the efforts of a visiting director to discover, through casting in an Azores village, a character existing only via report in The Tempest, and is finely tuned to a here and now debate about dispossession, invisibility, and exile. Whether as prompting discussion or rounding it off, this method is invariably generative. Many students come to the classroom well equipped with cinematic literacies, even if they don't realize it, ready to recognize how a film interpretation responds to a textual absence or clue. Finally, across the curriculum at Queen's, I try to embrace Shakespeare on film more generally. For example, we teach Othello in an introductory course on literature in transition at Year 1. We also separately screen the Oliver Parker film of Othello with Kenneth Branagh in the role of Iago as support. It's 1995. There are 2 advantages. First, we're fortunate to have at Queen's in our library the Kenneth Branagh archive, comprised of stills, screenplays, storyboards, publicity, and correspondence available for student use. From the start then, when I introduce the film, I can talk about film as process, as mobile and dynamic, and as Shakespearean adaptation as a venture uniquely dependent on funders, artists, distributors, and agents. Second, in that we arrange screenings in their own slots, I can emphasize that Shakespeare films, operating at multiple aesthetic, contextual, ideological, and sensory levels, are works of art in their own right. In so doing, I like to think that I make, at this preliminary stage, the critical point that underlines all of my teaching, that the original play and the film adaptation work in concert in a reciprocal fashion, whereby one casts light on the other in mutually nourishing, ongoing interrelations. And now, Dr. Abigail Rokison-Woodall.
So I'm going to say something about how I use my own research in my teaching, and I hope that it might be useful and might serve as inspiration. So I teach a module at the Shakespeare Institute called Shakespeare and Theatre Practice. This is actually an MA level module, which is taught in the School of English, Drama and Creative Studies. But I taught a similar undergraduate module at Cambridge, and I've done workshops on a number of these topics for school-age students. Shakespeare and Theatre Practice is a module on which students explore different theatrical approaches to Shakespeare in the professional theatre. It's broadly divided into 3 sections. So text-based approaches, Stanislavski-based approaches, and physical or movement-based approaches. Each week is devoted to a different area: Shakespeare and rhetoric, Shakespeare and verse speaking, Shakespeare and voice work, Shakespeare and you and thou, Shakespeare and Stanislavski, Shakespeare and Laban, Shakespeare and Lecoq. I give a short lecture about the practice, and then we have a 2.5-hour practical workshop session, trying out exercises and applying them to Shakespearean scenes. The idea is that students experience different ways of accessing the text and finding character. They can layer one technique upon another, or they can take the things that work for them and leave the ones that don't. Students are often surprised by the things that unlock a scene for them. At the same time, students are being critical. They're assessing the techniques and thinking about why some of them work better for particular characters or scenarios. So an example of this might be the difficulty of reconciling some of Stanislavski's ideas about naturalism with a rigorous approach to Shakespeare's verse, or applying given circumstances to a character when you don't know their age, their location, or even the year in which the play is set. I've also done workshops on some of these different areas for undergraduates internationally. The module is closely linked to the Arden Performance Companions, of which I'm a general editor, and recently co-wrote Shakespeare and Lecoq with Ed Woodall. In some ways, it's difficult to say whether the sessions on theatre practice stem from the Arden Performance Companions, or whether the module has to some extent influenced our commissioning, or both, which I think is probably the case. Certainly, each of the existing Arden Performance Companions finds its way onto the module: Shakespeare and rhetoric, you and thou, Shakespeare and Meisner, Shakespeare and Stanislavski, and Shakespeare and Lecoq. And when Shakespeare and Laban, which is being written by the brilliant Jack Bessel and Laura Weston, comes out, that will also go onto the syllabus, as will Steve Unwin's fascinating Shakespeare and Brecht. But actually, some of the reasoning behind commissioning these books was that I wanted to create a resource where practice, which is so often done rather than written about, could be recorded and supported by research. So I knew that many people, like me, would have encountered many of these approaches at drama school or in rehearsal rooms. I was an actor in a previous life, and I trained at drama school for 3 years. I found that one wouldn't always know, or in fact be told, from whence certain approaches came. So when I was at drama school, where I trained on a 3-year acting course, we used to do an exercise called weight, form and speed, and we used to apply it to various characters, Shakespearean and otherwise. It was only much later that I realized that this was basically Laban's effort actions under a different name. It feels really important to me that any student taking a degree or being asked to write about their practice knows where it comes from and is able to reference it appropriately. So this was one of the reasons behind commissioning the books, to have detailed, researched information about practitioners or practice alongside suggested exercises for the classroom. This way, students know where the exercises they're being taught come from. I could teach a Shakespeare and Lecoq class off the top of my head from varied experience and knowledge, but it's brilliant to be able to reference specific exercises in a published book. One of the challenges when working on scenes or monologues is text. So we talk quite early in the Shakespeare and Theatre Practice module about the different texts of Shakespeare, the early printed texts and textual variants that may offer a degree of choice to the actor. I also warn students against non-peer-reviewed Shakespeare texts that appear online. One year, a student wrote an essay about the metrical irregularities in Gertrude's Willow's speech in Hamlet. Metrical irregularities which don't exist in either of the two authoritative texts, but were the result of a poorly typed up version of the speech, which he had found online, in which various words were missing. I do encourage students to use the Arden performance editions in these classes because we've designed them for use by practitioners. I hope that the way in which we've made textual variants easy to see and only included those that are playable is helpful. I also hope that the notes on the meter are useful in assisting students in scanning their lines, something that I encourage them all to do in the early stages of the module. We try to get a strong sense of the iambic meter, clapping, marching, galloping. We steal Declan Donnellan's exercise about inventing our own lines of iambic. So, I think I'll go and have a cup of tea. It's cold outside. I think I'll need a vest, and so forth. And then we go through a speech all together, noting the metrical irregularities and asking ourselves whether these hold any particular interest or significance. We often find that when a character starts a speech with a trochee, so a foot, the metrical foot, which is stressed, unstressed, as opposed to an iamb, which is unstressed, stressed, or with a spondee, two stressed beats, they're often trying to seize a character or the audience's attention. When a character uses a lot of anapests, that metrical foot that goes diddy-dum, they frequently have a lot to say. They're trying to squeeze in extra syllables. After we do the exercise all together, I get the students to scan their own speeches for homework. I've actually also used the performance editions in a completely different module on textual studies. I've done a session on editing for performance, which includes the history of acting editions. And then I've given our students our editorial guidelines, and I've asked them to edit a scene. And at the end, we've compared what they've done with our editions, and they're surprisingly good at it. So I hope this is helpful in giving some ideas about the application of practical acting and directing techniques to Shakespeare in a way that is also academically rigorous. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Abigail. Now we have some time now for questions which can be put in the Q&A. So thank you to each of our speakers for your presentations and for what you share, your expertise, each quite different approaches. So hopefully that sparked some questions, some thoughts, reflections as to how the different elements could be integrated into the teaching by those who joined us today.